Okay, guys, we are live tonight on Standing for Truth, and we've got David Neff here who's going to be debating Superman himself. David and I have had so many debates that we wanted to give you guys something new. So, David, thanks for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
No problem, no problem. So, you excited for this one or what?
Oh, of course. Though I'm pretty sure Superman's going to knock me out of the park.
It's good to get you a new opponent. No, but seriously, so we've got, real quick, wanted to show the new book is in. Lots of pre-orders as well. So just wanted to show you the real thing. Definitely a must-have. People who ordered it should be in soon. So mine came in quickly. Glad to see that a lot of people are taking advantage. And so this is going to be a lot of fun. And tonight's debate actually is going to be a lot to do with the content of that book. And so this is, I'm definitely excited for it. I know David's excited for it. This kind of sparked from a comment thread from earlier today that we can cover probably in our opening statements. But yeah, thanks for being with us. Looks like we have a good audience tonight. And before we start, though, I'm going to plug this Friday. We've got Battle of the Neffs. Really, really looking forward to it. It's going to be an epic one. Nephilim free. And David Neff, no relation. They're going to be debating the global flood. So we're really excited for that one. And Saturday, so just when the fun begins, Saturday night, we're going to have Dr. Ron Garrett's back and Bill Morgan. So two fan favorites debating creation versus evolution. So it's going to be a lot of fun. Enough for me. David, thanks for being here. You got some introductory words. You can plug some stuff if you'd like as well before we get her going.
No, I really don't have anything right now. Thank you for plugging in my debate. And definitely after the debate, I will be having an open mic after show on my YouTube channel that will start probably 5 minutes after the debate ends. So everyone is welcome to jump in, share their comments, and just have a nice, friendly discussion.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So people in the chat, thanks for being here tonight. Let us know if there's any audio issues or anything going on, and we'll make sure we take care of that. We've already got some super chats. Doki Doki Bible Club, as always, thanks so much for the support. We've got a couple super stickers. Those $1.49 super stickers pay for my coffee addiction, so thank you so much. We've got a $20 super chat as well. Thank you. Putting all our kids through college, so we appreciate it, guys. We love the support. You guys are the superstars, the life and blood of this channel. So Chris Keith, super chat, $5. Standing for Truth after debate pizza money. I got 5 on it. Chris, I'm going to give you my address. I want you to join me for this pizza party. I'm actually craving some right now, to be honest with you. So thank you so much. Good to see everybody. And yeah, I guess, why don't we get started, David? I know that you wanted to start with your presentation. Easygoing debate tonight. More of probably just a cordial, respectful discussion. Therefore, as always, David, you are going to have my permission to take as much time as you want. If you got some slides to share, we can time it, and then whatever time you take, I'll take as well. And then we'll kind of go from there.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, cool. So you got the slides up already, so I will.
Yep. And since you gave me unlimited time, I think I'll be talking for the next 4 hours.
Oh, we are here for a long night, guys. Okay, so since I'm running things here in production, make sure that it's working. Pretty soon I'll master this, but
yeah. And let me pull up the screen, see if this works. Play from start. Is this full screen now?
Yes, it looks good. Looks good.
Okay. I'm just gonna exit out real quick. I guess I'll just give a brief introductory for kind of how this debate got started. This is kind of an impromptu debate, kind of discussion that kind of formed over the last couple of hours after a kind of like a little back and forth on Dr. Dan's channel. He has a new video on creation myths. Humans originated in the Middle East. It's a phenomenal video. He's a great guy, and I recommend that you check out that video. Standing for Truth commented, and then I replied to him, and he invited me on to have this discussion on whether or not a biblical Adam and Eve is scientifically plausible. So in this discussion, in my opening, I'm going to be kind of going over the brief evidence for why humans originated in Africa, and also we'll be covering why the Bible story simply does not hold any weight. So let's go. So these actually make testable predictions: Africa versus the Middle East. If Africa was the origin of humanity, Africa should have the most genetic diversity. Africa should also have the wealth of human fossils, and every human should be able to trace their lineage back to Africa. However, with the Middle East, with the Noah's Ark theory, the Middle East should have the most genetic diversity, and the Middle East should have the wealth of human fossils, and every living human should be able to trace their MRCA back to the Middle East 4,500 years ago. So now I want to kind of explain something called the founder effect. The founder effect occurs when a population migrates out into and starts a new colony, a new population somewhere else. What ends up happening is, as you can see in this photo, the new population loses some of the genetic diversity in the mother population. And so the original population in Africa would therefore have the most genetic diversity, and that's exactly what we see. And Standing for Truth does not dispute that one bit. Now I want to talk about the effects of inbreeding and why a 4,500-year-old inbreeding event simply is not possible. And I will be, this is a little bit of a preview of my arguments on Friday. Inbreeding is the production of offspring from the mating or breeding of individual organisms that are closely related genetically. Genetic counselor Joanne Scott says, if you have a child with someone that is in the general population, the chances that the two of you would carry the very same recessive gene is pretty low. But when you marry a relative, the probability that you are carrying the same recessive gene is much higher, and so you're in a much higher risk to have a child with a recessive disorder. And that is exactly what we see. Populations that are inbred, such as the Ashkenazi Jew and the European royalty, they are very much inbred, and they have a very high susceptibility rate to genetic disorders. And here is actually case in point, the cheetahs. They suffered a severe bottleneck effect about 10,000 years or so ago that significantly reduced their genetic study. A 5-year study from the early 80s showed that the cheetah gene pool resembles that of a highly inbred mice used for scientific research. Essentially, the entire population has been built up from too small of a stock. The result was a species in which 70% of males had abandoned sperm, and infant mortality soared to over 29%, even in captivity. In the wild, only about 5% of cheetahs survived to adulthood. To give you an idea of just how serious the inbreeding problem is in cheetahs, among related animals of most species, you can expect to see an 80% gene similarity related to cheetahs having 99% gene similarity. Their genes are so remarkably similar, in fact, even between unrelated animals, skin grafts aren't rejected. Any one cheetah is basically another one's identical twin. And of course, if the story of Noah's flood actually did happen and everything was reduced to 2 of everything, and humans had only 8 populations left, we would see exactly this in our gene pool. In fact, as I will explain Friday, everything would be extinct within a few months after the flood. Now I want to kind of share this. This is my genetic story. I got my nuclear DNA sequence from Ancestry.com, and they were able to tell me exactly where my family settled, where my family came from Europe, and actually was able to identify where we came to, namely the southern United States. And here we go, the northern Alabama settlers. My biological mom was born in Alabama, and I was born in Arkansas. So it is absolutely fascinating that they can look at the DNA and pinpoint exactly where we came from and when we got here, and the precise location in the United States. That's just incredibly powerful evidence that we can derive just by looking at DNA. So using the same principles that determined my origins, we use the same scientific and determined that anatomically modern humans originated in southern Africa about 200,000 years ago. And here's a paper from Nature. Anatomically modern humans originated in Africa about 200,000 years ago. And using the same map that I used that Ancestry.com made, we can actually use this to map out the map for the migration of the mitochondrial DNA. As you see here, it started out in Africa, southern Africa, and it diversified outward. Some misconceptions. The most recent common ancestor is not the first human to have existed, nor is it the only human to have existed in that time, but rather, as it suggests, it's the most recent common ancestor. Thus, if the flood model was correct, then Noah and his wife would be the most recent common ancestor of all of us, even though the model would say that Adam and Eve are the first humans. And number three, if that were true, then we should all be able to trace our origins 4,500 years ago to the Middle East, yet our lineage goes back much further into Africa. And here we go. Here's another study that does just this. This is taking a look of Europeans. The most recent common ancestor for all Europeans lived around 1,000 years ago. And of course, they weren't the first European, but just the one that had to be it's just the most recent common ancestor of all Europeans. Next, let's into the fascinating fossil evidence. First, we get to Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis. Lived about 3.85 to 2.95 billion years ago in East Africa. Her species is represented by over 400 individuals. And unlike chimps, they were fully bipedal and did not walk on their knuckles. They had a brain size about 1/3 of that of modern humans. Next, we get to Homo habilis, 2.4 million to 1.4 million years ago. One of the earliest members of the Homo genus, if not the first member. They made stone tools, and they had a cranial capacity of 612 cc. Homo habilis, first to build shelter, 1280 cc. So we are seeing already a significant progress here, and they lived about 300,000 to 600,000 years ago. Next, we get to Homo naledi, cranial capacity 560 cc. Next, Homo erectus. Homo erectus is my personal favorite. Lived 1.89 million and 110,000 years ago. They lived for a very long time. They were very, very diverse from each other. They were more different from each other than we are. And here's their range. They've been found all through Africa, all throughout Africa, into Europe, and into Asia, and all the way down into Indonesia. So they had a very large range. Next, we get to Homo neanderthalensis. Neanderthals, they had a cranial capacity that is larger than humans. Our DNA analysis shows that we last had a common ancestor about 800,000 years ago. And they definitely cared for the dead. And they're represented by hundreds of fossil species. And here we go. Once again, here's their range all throughout Europe, even into Israel and in Middle East. And there you have it. That concludes my opening. Was I muted the whole time?
No. We heard you. I was muted the whole time. So thank you so much. Looks like Praise took care of your screen. Let me just have a drink of water here. Okay. So I kind of stopped losing count. Looked like it was about maybe 9 minutes, 8 or 9 minutes. Did you keep track of the exact number, Praise, by any chance? No, Praise, can you hear?
Yeah. He went about 7 minutes.
Okay.
I think it was a total about 10 minutes. So we'll
it looked like it was about, because I lost track after about 7. I started writing down some things he was saying. So let's, I'll make sure I don't go any longer than 10 minutes. A lot of this stuff I'd rather just discuss in discussion portion anyways. I've had enough debates where people have seen my presentations. They kind of know what to expect. So praise, just make sure I don't go over 10 minutes and
Will do.
we'll kind of go from there. Okay, let's start now. So David's right that we this would be our fourth maybe debate. And what I appreciate about David is he is so willing to have these very important dialogues and discussions. So a lot of the times I come across what I call evolutionist keyboard warriors. So, they think I'm going to spend all day in comment sections when typically I'll leave one or two comments and then I'll say, why don't we set up a live discussion or debate where we can kind of hash it out. So that's exactly what happened today. Dr. Dan made a video. He released a video bringing forth arguments that we dealt with that he'd obviously disagree with, which is fine. But we dealt with it the other day. So I left a comment debunking one of his more significant points that he brought up in the video. And David commented, and we and set this debate up. So I'm excited. So what Dr. Dan was hinting at in his video, and you can look at it, had to do a lot of it with the out of Africa, and which is a lot of what David presented. So I love this topic. We're going to have a lot of fun. So he was saying there's a lot of highly variable places in the genome that created heterozygosity cannot account for. Okay, so to reiterate my response to Dr. Dan, all God had to do when it comes to front-loaded genetic diversity is engineer 10 million variants into Adam, and from there, everything else is easily explained. And this actually makes sense, and this is where we're going to discuss the data, because David has purported that there's no evidence for this, that this is just post hoc ad hoc. So considering the fact that there are between 10 and 15 million common variants worldwide, this makes sense. We actually have roughly 3 million within ourselves. Adam would only need 10 million, not difficult at all. So original created genotypes is entirely plausible as well, given the absolute failure of abiogenesis and the origins of life research. I'm sure that David would probably agree at this point in time, there's no empirical data suggesting that life could or has originated from non-living chemicals long ago and far away. So that means the created heterozygosity hypothesis is the far better, more plausible explanation. So anyways, most of our world's variation is two alleles, yes, A or C, G or T, with an allele being a flavor of a gene. Now, after creation, of course, we have thousands of years to what? Build up mutations. Okay, the vast majority of, say, our nuclear genome, though, which is the recombining DNA, the biparentally inherited DNA, we inherit 2 copies from our parents, that would be mostly 99% created genetic diversity. Okay, so now, and mutations would add a little bit to this, of course, but that would probably be under 1%. Now, therefore, many alleles, say the ones restricted to certain populations, would be the result of mutations over time. For example, blue eyes is clearly the result of mutations over time. Now, Dr. Dan was right on one thing in his video, that there are some exceptions to the rule, and David and I can discuss this in great detail. I addressed this thoroughly in the new Refuting Critics book. What this exception to the rule is the fact that we have some cases where we have several hundred alleles or variants. One example is actually the human immune system. There's an extensive amount of variation in the immune system among people worldwide. We have 7 billion people or more today, as we know. Think about how many family trees there are, okay? You start with Adam, who was created with front-loaded genetic diversity, and this actually makes sense. When God said, be fruitful and multiply, did he mean this to be carried out through cloning? No, of course not. So we have Adam, created de novo, of course, with the front-loaded genetic diversities. And then you begin to branch outwards. We now have plenty of time, thousands of years, for a mutation to happen over here, a mutation to happen over here, a mutation to happen in multiple places. Now, given this fact with highly mutable genes that we can survive with, it turns out in genetics that we have lots of variation. It also looks like, and we can get into this another time or today, but it looks like we can inherit a lot of traits that we have acquired. Now, these hypermutable genes used in our immune system, meaning it would obviously be highly profitable to have lots of immune system variants. It is therefore within the design parameters of this class of genes to be what? Highly mutable, with intention, with purpose, with design in mind. This requires forward thinking. And in the discussion, I'd like to ask David, how does he explain the forward-thinking mechanisms that are clearly evident in the genomes of living biological organisms? So that'll be a question and something we can delve into in the discussion. So the point is there isn't a problem with created heterozygosity. And somebody like Dr. Dan, who's been at this for a while, he believes these are some of the best arguments against a literal Adam and Eve. And as you can see, it's easily demolished. And you can go see the comment section, and he had a lack of response. And David, I thank for being willing to discuss this. Now, let's kind of get into more to do with the evidence for Adam and Eve. I'll screen share here with a couple of slides because I think I still have a few minutes. So I'm going to stop the timer, screen share. Okay. And just for sake of time in the opening, plus I know people like discussion periods, I'll save a lot of what David was saying for the discussion portion. Okay, I just want to make sure you guys can see the screen. You can see it, David?
Yes, I can see it. It's kind of, yeah, it's good now. Perfect.
Yeah, it looks like it's freezing there. Okay, so I'll start the time again. Looks like I've got a few minutes. So, okay, so why don't we go over the facts? For example, we know all human beings are 99.9% identical in their genetic makeup, okay? Here's a source that confirms this. Okay, amazingly, if we actually have descended from just two people thousands of years ago, what would we expect? Okay, low genetic diversity in humans today. If deep time evolution were true, as David is purporting here today, we've essentially been accruing genetic mistakes for millions and millions of years. We should then expect high levels of genetic diversity. That's why the evolutionists were shocked when they discovered this data suggesting that humans are 99.999% identical. So what they did was they resorted to a post hoc, ad hoc story, what I call a rescue device. They purported this hypothetical out of Africa population bottleneck. Now, he talked about inbreeding. Inbreeding would be a huge problem for this out of Africa bottleneck. These mutations, these deleterious mutations that have been accumulating for millions and millions of years, they would then be manifested. And also, they would reach the point of fixation. Fixation simply means to be fixed, to be stuck in place. This would lead to rapid and accelerated genetic degeneration. We can talk about that more in the discussion portion. The inbreeding, it's not an issue for our position because we have a starting position of created front-loaded genetic diversity. There'd be no genetic mistakes to come to the forefront, leading to rapid and accelerated genetic mutation or degeneration. So here's a couple more papers. Gene mutations began showing up in the last 5,000 years of human evolution. What a coincidence that is. Evidence for a human Y chromosome molecular clock. There's only about 4,500 years worth of mutation accumulation in the Y chromosome. We know 4,500 years ago, that would be the time of Noah. Is this all just a coincidence? These molecular clock data, it's been tested, it's been confirmed. Testable predictions, for example, that's the gold standard of science. I brought this up last time to David, and he didn't have an answer then, which is fine. What I like about David is he does go and do further research for future debate so we can discuss these issues. So we know the chimpanzee and human Y chromosomes are incredibly divergent in not only structure, but also gene content. So we can discuss why that is the case. Let's see here. Another fascinating observation is 80% of proteins are actually different between humans and chimpanzees. We know the mitochondrial Eve sequence. We know that there's incredibly low variation in human mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome. We find no ancient mitochondrial DNA lines. We find no divergent Y chromosomes. All of this is consistent with a literal Adam and Eve just thousands of years ago. How old is humanity? Mitochondrial DNA was found to mutate about 20 times faster than previously thought. Humans typically differ from one another by 18 mutations. So this is incredibly easy to explain from a biblical perspective, incredibly difficult to explain without invoking phylogeny-based assumptions, substitution rates. You see these critics, these PhDs that attack the biblical creation model. They say we need to calibrate the data with the assumed geological time frame. They'll say that, the raw mutation rate from pedigree-based studies starts off fast, but eventually a lot of these mutations, they're weeded out and it equals a substitution rate after X number of generations. I've heard it over and over again. Without any testable predictions that can flow from that explanation, though, it's nothing but pseudoscience. Parsons paper. Amazing. They say it's an outlier, but when this came out, it confirmed a 6,000-year date, and they looked for rescue device after rescue device to explain away the data. When in fact, the Parsons study looked at a wide range of people. There are a lot of variants, a lot of diversity. This is how a study should be in order to get an accurate date. And lo and behold, it confirmed a literal Adam and Eve. We can get into the fossil record as well. He brought up the Australopithecines, habilis, Neanderthalensis. I think it's almost going to be 10 minutes, so I'll end it with this study that I'd like to talk to David about as well, where they analyzed barcodes across 100,000 species, and they were shocked to find such incredibly low diversity in the CL1 gene in the mitochondria. One researcher even said that he fought it as hard as he could, and the study, being a secular study, showed that species have very clear genetic boundaries, just as we'd expect given the biblical base model, and that over 90% of species arrived at the same time. So that corroborates the Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA data that suggests that we have originated from just two people. Now we have perfect correlation to the biblical model of the flood and, of course, creation. So I could go on and on all day, but I think it's probably coming close to my 10 minutes, I'd imagine. Praise. Everything that I've written down, I'll make sure that we do touch on, though, with the out of Africa scenario and inbreeding, the fossil record. So this is going to be a lot of fun. This is another phylogenetic tree that I brought up. I think it was in 2 debates ago, you and I had, David, where Dr. Nathaniel Jensen derived this from hundreds of mitochondrial DNA variants, where the tree, when visualized, shows up as 3 major haplogroups, L, M, and N, consistent with Noah's 3 daughters-in-law, leads to testable predictions on the history of civilization. If these DNA differences, and you can see this line right here, the African line does go back the furthest, suggesting that they have the most diversity as compared to non-Africans. So we're going to discuss why that may be. But if this all goes back just 4,500 years or 6,000 years, of course, if this goes back 4,500 years to the flood, then the history of civilization should be detected in our genome. And Dr. Jensen has an active research program where he's looking for these genetic signatures on the history of civilization, the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, the Mongol Empire, and he's got fascinating results. So if his methodology is wrong, if the arguments we're using are wrong, why is it all working so well is the question. So I'm gonna end there, give the floor to David David, address whatever you want, take as much time as you need. Wherever you want to start off with, we can, and then we'll kind of go from there. We'll have some good, you brought up a lot of good points, so this is going to be good discussion. I didn't really have an opening plan, so I kind of just winged it there, but I think the point came across well. that the evidence is certainly consistent with a literal, historical, and scientific Adam and Eve. So, David, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. I want to begin by thanking SFT and praise for being here. And once again, thank you, SFT, for inviting me on. Well, I want to begin by pointing out that in my last debate on with Standing for Truth on some of the issues on radiometric dating, is that he used the word assumption sometimes and called us out when having different assumptions. However, I want to point out that SFT has a few assumptions on his own. For example, he assumes created heterozygosity. Second, I want to point out that there is a false dilemma fallacy being presented here, that it is either creation or evolution, when in fact that there are various different views. For example, there are many great scientists like Francis Collins who are theists and also accept the theory of evolution. Evolution is a theory on the biodiversity of life, and it is not a theory on the origins of life. As I said before, abiogenesis is a field still in its infancy. We don't know everything yet. So we don't know exactly how life started exactly, and that is okay. This is the classic God of the gaps fallacy, and perhaps you and I could sit down and do a separate stream just talking about abiogenesis. But there is fascinating research that is being done. For example, we know the building blocks of proteins and other essential functions have been found in space and in nature. So we're already quite a the way there. And a recent study in Nature, actually October 4th, 2019, lab-made primordial soup yields RNA bases. The chemical feed strengthens theory that the first life on Earth was based in RNA. So there is fascinating research being done on that end. Still nowhere near set in stone. I'll greatly admit that there's a lot of unknowns, and we might never fully know the answer, and I'm okay with that. But I am not okay with doing the God of the ass fallacy, saying I don't know, therefore it must be God. The next thing I wanted to talk about is Jensen's paper on mtDNA study on his 4,000-year timeline. And can I share my screen real quick? One more time, Chrome tab. Can I share my screen real quick?
Yes. Yeah. Let me approve it. Boom. You're good to go. Take your time.
There is a creationist response to Jensen's paper. In a number of papers, Dr. Nathaniel Jensen's and co-workers claim to have documented the recent origin of humans using mitochondrial DNA. I questioned the results and argued that Dr. Jensen should include Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA in such analysis. In a number of papers, Dr. Nathaniel Jensen, together with co-workers, study up the mtDNA in order to trace human ancestry. Neanderthals and Denisovans are usually considered fully human and should therefore be concluded in such analysis unless good reasons for not doing so can be given. In Jensen 2015a, the author includes both Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo heidelbergensis in the analysis of human ancestry, but dismisses the results. He calls these archaic humans unusual and speculates their divergence from modern humans is due to a high mutation rate or unreliable sequencing. And Jensen, the authors do not include Neanderthals or Denisovans in the analysis and makes no comment as to why not. In other words, he is missing a significant factor. He's missing some crucial evidence that could completely change the results. It'll be like me doing a study on the origins of humans or the story of human migration, but instead I only do Europeans and leave out Africans and Asians. That's going to be a huge issue. Next, he talks about inbreeding. That is definitely a huge issue. I definitely want to talk in depth about this point, and especially since it's also going to be coming up in our discussion on Noah's Flood on Friday. is that what's going to happen if you reduce everything to 2 individuals, like what would happen during the Noah's flood, and you would have gotten something like what happened to the cheetah. Usually SFT dismisses Homo erectus, Homo naledi, and Heidelbergensis and others as fully human, but they were highly mutated and variable. Let's just concede this point for a moment. Let's just say that this is what happened. The question that I have for standing is, why hasn't our lineage been affected the same way that their lineage has? And if we were to go back in time and see Noah, would he have looked like a Homo sapien, or would he have looked like something completely different? I also would like to have talked to him about some of the dates that are given for these fossils. Lots of really fascinating stuff with radiometric dating that completely and totally refute the young Earth timeline. Even just the radiometric dating alone completely blows everything out of the water. But yeah, I kind of want Standing for Truth to talk about the inbreeding issue first, and how anything could possibly have survived the flood. All the prey animals would have been completely eaten the second they got off the ark for the predators. And of course, once that happens, they're gone, they're extinct. I also want to have Standing for Truth address the issue of the founder effect. He seemed to agree that, and he didn't challenge this in his response, that Africa has the highest genetic diversity. So therefore, based upon what we know about the founder effect, the original population, the mother population, would have the greatest genetic diversity. Now, Standing for Truth usually creates a rescue device by saying that Africans were highly mutated. I want to know what his evidence is for that, and why that would fit so perfectly with the fossil record, phylogenetics, and other evidence that points to an out of African origin. I also want him to, I just want to also bring up an interesting point, and maybe as a sidebar note, would it be possible for Ararat to for the ark to land in somewhere in Africa rather than in the Middle East, which would explain why Africa would be the origin of humanity and not the Middle East. So a lot of stuff to discuss right there. For Truth, what would you like to discuss first?
Well, what I'll do is I'll take equal time that you just did. I'm definitely not one to interrupt somebody, so you take as much time as you need. I wrote down a list of everything you talked about, so I'm going to try and address it one by one. I don't like to leave anything unturned, unaddressed. I would say, since we both brought up a lot of good topics, let's stick to what's been brought up, and we'll try and discuss those in as much detail as we can. Hopefully come to some resolutions by the end of this discussion. I think this is going to be a lot of fun. You brought up a lot of good points. A few points I brought up I'd like to talk to you about as well. So I'll just start from right from the beginning of what you said, and then we can choose one of those, I guess, to kind of delve more into. I think the out of Africa issue and the African genetic diversity is going to be important to discuss in this issue, and since that's the topic. So the first thing you mentioned was abiogenesis. Research, for example, I think what you said was highly exaggerated. They're nowhere close. I agree that there's probably a strong chance. I would say there's no chance they're ever going to figure out answer the question of origins. And the problem is those RNA world experiments, they involve a lengthy series of highly orchestrated steps, which include purifying desired products, removing unwanted byproducts, changing physical and chemical conditions. What they often do is they add unrealistically high concentrations of assisting substances and other interventions to ensure that the target molecules themselves are achieved. So it's highly manipulated, controlled chemistry that has absolutely no relevance to the early Earth. And Dr. Tour, speaks very vocally that they are nowhere near solving this issue. So I always say that it comes down to testable and falsifiable predictions. So if the evidence seems to suggest at this point that there's no plausible explanation empirically for the origin of life, then the only other alternative would be special creation. And of course, special creation being, as I say, if we start from the biblical position that God would have created Adam and Eve and specific groups of organisms, it makes no sense that God would have, this designer would have created organisms, would have created the first humans like a vessel with just no information inside. Makes no sense, like robots, for example. So when God said, be fruitful and multiply, this only makes sense theologically and scientifically that God would have front-loaded his creation with pre-existing DNA differences. Now, here's the thing. Is it post hoc ad hoc? Well, it leads to testable predictions, some that have already come true, some that are being tested currently, predictions on mutation rates, DNA function, predictions on the function of DNA elements like retrotransposons, pseudogenes, ALUs. So lots of predictions regarding allele frequencies around the earth. For example, we have traces of Babel, traces of the creation event, all throughout our genome. So it's going to come down to testable and falsifiable predictions. Abiogenesis has none of that, while the created heterozygosity hypothesis does. You mentioned Francis Collins, and what's funny is I've been having a lengthy discussion with Dr. Joshua Swamidas, who used to work for BioLogos, I believe, and he rejects Francis Collins. He's a theistic evolutionist, but he rejects Francis Collins and Dr. Vanima of BioLogos. Their main argument against a literal Adam and Eve is that there's far too much genetic diversity to explain in just 6,000 years. According to them, we'd have to invoke extremely unrealistic mutation rates, and those mutation rates are just not possible. Francis Collins and Dr. Vanima have said those types of mutation rates would mutate us out of existence. But it's funny because these are the guys, Francis Collins, these are the ones that are often invoked as a way to say, hey, look, we have Christians who accept universal common ancestry and say that there's no evidence for a literal Adam and Eve, and that this genetic data suggests that it's impossible. But what I find funny is that on one hand, evolutionists resort to a recent and extreme genetic bottleneck, like I was talking about earlier in the Out of Africa theory, to explain why there really is such low genetic diversity among humans. While on the other hand, you've got Francis Collins, Dr. Vanima, and of course your atheistic evolutionists claiming that there's just too much diversity to allow for a literal scientific Adam and Eve. But like we said, if Adam was intelligently designed, as the evidence seems to suggest, then he would have obviously had a great number of design genetic variants. And I'm going to quote Dr. Sanford and Dr. Robert Carter here, who say it perfectly. They say, otherwise, all people would essentially be clones of Adam and Eve, which would be bad design for many obvious reasons. How much genetic variation could be designed into the genomes of Adam and Eve? The answer might seem surprising, they say. Essentially, all known single-letter variants, okay, within the current human population could have been programmed into two diploid individuals such as Adam and Eve. Together, Adam and Eve had 4 sets of chromosomes. Since there are only 4 genetic letters, A, T, C, G, Adam and Eve could have had any possible combination of SNP variants. They could easily have been heterozygous at 100 million nucleotide sites. But we do not need anything like this to explain modern human diversity. And I said this earlier, and I've said this numerous times, and they confirm what I've been saying here. They say even now a single person, okay, myself, you, David, Praise, is heterozygous at roughly 4 million sites and carries a large part of all human variation. What I'm about to say here is not part of the quote, but a wife and a husband, okay, a couple, could theoretically, hypothetically, have millions of children, and no 2 children would be genetically identical because we are heterozygous. We have built-in genetic diversity. So this isn't post hoc, ad hoc. This is all empirical. So now here's the thing, though. When we actually look at allele frequencies, and there's been highly technical papers on this, And since most, I'm going to go back to their quote, they say, since most common variations are not associated with disease, this goes to the prediction of created heterozygosity, okay? Most variations could very reasonably be attributed to design variation. What would prevent God from engineering 10 to 15 million variants into Adam from the very beginning? If we assume Eve was assigned her own unique genome, it would double the amount of potential design variation. God could have created different genomes in each of Adam and Eve's reproductive cells. What they're saying here is there's really no limit to how much diversity God could have designed into Adam and Eve. But here's the thing. We don't need to invoke that. All we need to invoke is simple heterozygosity, because we know there's 10 to 15 million common variants found around the globe. We each have about 3 million, and Adam would have only needed 10 million to explain everything we see today when it comes to allele frequencies. We see that Y chromosomes are geographically specific. X chromosomes are consistent with the biblical perspective. See, we don't have to invoke population bottlenecks after population bottlenecks, extinction events after extinction events. The levels of diversity, the Y chromosome data, the mitochondrial DNA data is all consistent with a first couple. I do want to address the African diversity, but if you have something to say there real quick, and then I will address the African diversity and the inbreeding that you keep talking about, because I'd like you, if you want to start with the inbreeding, you can, but here's the issue. And then I'll say this one last thing, and then I'll let you go, and we can kind of move it into a. You can proceed however you want. You can take as long as you want, David. But I always say the longer you take, more points you bring up, then the longer I'm going to have to take to respond to it all. So let me just let me go over the out of Africa theory real quick. So, like I said, it was a huge surprise to the evolutionary community that modern humans have incredibly low genetic diversity. Okay. When we study, and you kind of covered this, the genetic implications of the out of Africa model, David. When we actually study the genetic variation in humans today, we find that most of the world's variation is found in Africa. People outside of Africa have less overall genetic variation than people inside of Africa. They've actually observed that most DNA sequences outside of Africa have close relatives inside of Africa. Why is this, would be the question, right? Well, they're going to say that the direct ancestors of us, people living today, are thought to have emerged first in Africa. They say in Africa, they would have accrued genetic variations through genetic mutations over time, of course. And then portions of that variation would have at some point went out and colonized the rest of the world. And experts in the fields of human evolution, they have proposed that this all occurred within the last 100,000 years. This is essentially the genetic basis for the out of Africa origins that you were talking about. There's some issues here, though. What happened, and this kind of gets into your hominins too, when our so-called ancestors left Africa to colonize the rest of the world, what they discovered was other forms of humans. Okay, Neanderthalensis, for example, Denisovans, and these humans appeared to be there for long periods of time. And according to those experts in human evolution, some would say that they've been outside of Africa since about 2 million years ago. So now they have to invoke two out of Africas that a population of Erectus would have left prior and evolved independently into these other human forms. And most famous of the forms are the Neanderthals, like you were talking about. And we're going to talk about that because I know you brought up Dr. Jensen's paper and what happens when we include Neanderthals. So we'll have a good discussion on that as well. They found other human forms as well that look like they were extinct. Now, here's the thing. Paleo experts have competing theories as to how all this is possible. They try to answer the question, how and when did modern humans leave Africa? How did they remain interfertile with the Neanderthals when in fact there was independent genetic reshaping for hundreds of thousands of years going on? So there's a lot of these questions. Also, if Homo erectus was evolving for millions and millions of years, living in Africa, why are there so few dead bodies? Where are all the dead bodies? I mean, if they have an average generation time of 20 to 30 years, we should see billions and billions of fossils, yet all the erectus fossils can actually be fit into the trunk of a car. So where are all these so-called human ancestors of ours? Go ahead. You can take as long as you want, David, as always, or if you want to just kind of focus in on one topic and do it back and forth, totally up to you. Go ahead.
Yeah, it sounds good. Sure. So I want to address your last question first, is that why we haven't found all these fossils. The reason is, two reasons. Number one is that fossilization is rare. And the second reason is that we have only just recently started looking. Of course, as more expeditions and as more archaeology is being undertaken, the more we are going to find. What is indisputable is the fact that they did have a huge range, and what is indisputable is the dates that are given by radiometric dating. And I would love to talk with him about that and his theory of accelerated nuclear decay, since I know that's what he's going to bring up. But I do want to ask him, since I kind of want to do this like an open forum kind of response. As I asked a question earlier, according to you, all of these different Homo species are they are fully human, that were highly inbred and mutated after the arc. The question that I have is, I guess as well, would Noah look like a Homo sapien, or would he look like something else? What do you think?
Good question. So I would say, and it's mostly skeptical, I would say that Noah would have looked more like a modern Homo sapien, because I would say that a lot of your mutant forms, for example, Erectus, Neanderthalensis, Heidelbergensis, Naledi, of course, Floresiensis as well. There's even been a newer one, Luzonensis. And what's funny is a lot of these, like Naledi, Luzonensis, and Floresiensis, are found on islands, isolated, highly inbred. And a lot of times the secularists will conclude island dwarfism and attribute their features to the results of inbreeding small populations, because what happens is those mutations come to the forefront and lead to rapid and accelerated genetic degeneration, and you see pathology oftentimes associated with these bones that the evolutionary community say are old or say are transitional. And that's where I've got that paper that I've shown you multiple times, the Trinkos paper, that concludes that. So no, those mutant forms, the features, the anomalous features, the atypical features that the paleo experts pick up and conclude oftentimes that this is transitional when it's actually just riddled with pathology. Modern Homo sapiens, that line, that lineage, they would not have been riddled with pathology and disease in the same way that these mutant forms were. They broke off from Babel either prior to Babel or afterwards. They would have became isolated, highly inbred. That's why you see these Neanderthals are highly inbred. They carried a high genetic load. And you were talking about with the Neanderthals, why do they have genetic markers that are unique? For example, why on the phylogenetic tree, why do they fall outside? The Homo sapiens, for example. Well, we actually have a ready answer for that is supported by the data itself. So, for example, I'll say this and then let you go on. But I think this is an important one when it comes to the Neanderthal. So what I'm saying is the accelerated degeneration of small inbred populations. We do see this in the hominin fossil record. And we see this in the Trinkos paper. He also concludes other things like stress. He concludes survivorship. For example, Erica Gotze-Gibbon put out a video recently saying that I misrepresented the paper, but I just find that funny because, of course, the post-Babel, post-flood world would have consisted of survivorship. I mean, the question is, did these modern humans come in? And a lot of the times, maybe some of these so-called pre-humans went extinct due to conquest, or was there assimilation? Of course, stress. Stress from the Ice Age related conditions can result in mutations in the DNA repair enzymes, which would then lead to hypermutation. And we can actually see that in the Neanderthal genomes themselves. But I'm going to say this about the Neanderthal. So Dr. Robert Carter actually explains it. He says genetic drift, and this is a fact, genetic drift occurs more rapidly in small populations. And according to standard population genetics theory, the likelihood of any new mutation displacing all other alleles within the population is directly proportional to the size of the population. That is, in a population of 1,000 individuals, a new mutation has a chance of 1 in 1,000 of becoming fixed. Now, he says if the Neanderthal population was small, and we know it was, okay, this is backed up by science, or was restricted to a small size for a number of generations, as has been hypothesized in a number of these Neanderthal papers, what would happen, David? Well, genetic drift could have occurred rapidly, because small populations, as we know, they're at a greater risk of extinction. Look at the cheetahs, due to the high rate of mutation accumulation, which eventually leads to extinction due to air catastrophe. So this Neanderthal sequence that they've looked at has many deleterious mutations, several of those in one particular gene. We see this in their genome. There's no question. They went extinct due to inbreeding, mutation accumulation, or just the recessive mutations coming to the forefront. Because why is this so? Should not natural selection have weeded out these negative mutations? Instead, they accumulated. And Dr. Carter says the authors of this paper, which is a paper that I can send you, said that purifying selection had broken down. This is evidence for a high mutation rate acting on a small population. This is why the critics of biblical creation need to look at all the relevant research. And the specific article you can read Carter talking about this is called Taking a Crack at the Neanderthal Mitochondrial Genome. So here's the thing. Those genetic markers that are unique to Neanderthals and unique to Homo sapiens is exactly what we would expect as biblical creations. Those mutations would become fixated, of course. And the entirety of the hominin fossil record, you were talking about radiometric dating, but it's funny, when it comes to the hominin fossil record, the radiometric dating, especially potassium argon, is constantly coming up with false dates. They're constantly rearranging the history of human evolution. They admit that it's a bushy mess. What's funny is I have a paper here, I'll screen share it, and most people would agree with this, Erica would, that the Australopithecines coexisted with the Homo genus. They've all coexisted. That's why we see intermingling of the Australopithecus bones and the Homo bones, mainly Homo erectus, a mutant form of Homo sapiens. Plus, we see foot tracks that are anatomically modern, human-looking, in layers with the Australopithecines where they shouldn't be. We see anatomically modern human footprints in tools and things like this associated with modern humans outside of Africa, like in Crete, for example. So, I mean, their entire ape to man story is just a mess. So radiometric dating is no help. But the thing is, the direct evidence, like the molecular clock data, especially in the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome, just takes us back, as I showed in my opening, 4,500 years and 6,500 years. So go ahead, David.
Yeah, and the fact that they did coexist is no problem for evolution. Daughter species can coexist with their ancestral species, no problem whatsoever. I don't necessarily see that as being problematic at all.
Well, the reason. Oh, no, go ahead. You take as much time as you want, then I'll respond.
But I kind of wanted to get talk about some of the post-Babel stuff, kind of cross-examine a little bit of that stuff, and kind of want to go like a 90-second back and forth on that. That way, I have a lot of questions about this. That way, I can better know how to kind of address that model.
Well, actually, real quick, because I just answered a question, though, I think it's fair. If you could just answer one of my questions, answer the inbreeding one. How do you explain the extensive inbreeding that would have occurred in your out of Africa scenario? Because remember, it wasn't one generation, two generations. It's even hard to find a number. It's easily well over 1,000 years that this population of 2 to 10, maybe 2 to 30,000 remains small. There is subsequent inbreeding leading to rapid genetic degeneration. You showed the cheetahs. You're absolutely right. Cheetahs are down to like 7,000 because of the inbreeding. They're incredibly genetically damaged. Their sperm is degenerate. They're probably going to go extinct. So why would you have us believe that in this out of Africa scenario, these 2 to 10,000, maybe 30,000 highly genetically compromised humans suddenly exploded out of Africa into all parts of the world, seizing dominion over the planet? Can you explain how that's plausible empirically? And then you ask me a question. We'll kind of take turns.
Okay, yeah, sure. So I kind of see that argument as being self-refutation. It's kind of like a self-refuting argument, kind of like your argument about orphan genes. And the reason why I say this is because according to your own model, the flood model, everything, all mankind was reduced to only 8 people, and all of the animal population was just reduced to 2 people from the individual kinds. If that's not self-refutation, I don't know what is, because you're saying that only a couple of thousand would be so inbred that they're unable to, that they'll become extinct with the issues of inbreeding and all that. But you would have the same problem with the Noah's Ark theory, and it's even worse if you try and get everything down to only 8 individuals.
Yeah, but how do you explain the origin of all genetic diversity and DNA differences? Your model.
Okay, sure. So, of course, I do agree that there was definitely some inbreeding and there was definitely some bottleneck effects. There is definitely strong evidence that humanity almost became extinct several thousand years ago, a couple tens of thousand years ago.
No, I'm just asking, like, for example, all those DNA differences, because you're saying my model also has an inbreeding problem. And we know that inbreeding reveals the hidden reservoir of genetic mistakes. Those mistakes that have been accumulating, those mutations that have been accumulating are now manifested, leading to disease, pathology, rapid accelerated genetic degeneration. So my question to you is, those DNA differences, the genetic diversity, because inbreeding reduces levels of heterozygosity and you get higher levels of homozygosity. What's the origin of those according to your model? How did those come about ultimately over time?
Honestly, not sure. Honestly,
well no, I didn't mean to catch you off guard. The origin of all DNA differences and genetic diversity according to evolution is what?
I'm sorry?
The origin of all DNA differences and genetic diversity, according to the evolutionary model, is what? What's the origin of all DNA? How did all DNA diversity come about?
Through de novo evolution and from other mutations and all.
From mutate, yeah. There you go. So evolution explains all DNA differences as the result of mutations over time. That's why it is, and this is oftentimes the arguments coming from the critics, and it sucks because they'll use arguments assuming evolution, when in fact, as biblical creationists, we propose created DNA diversity. God would have front-loaded these functional DNA differences into Adam and Eve. This would apply across all kinds. And then we have mutations, okay, for thousands of years. But the majority of the DNA differences, the majority of the genetic diversity in our genomes would be the result of divine created nuclear heterozygosity. So if inbreeding, okay, by definition, reveals the hidden reservoir of what? Genetic mistakes. Mutations, for example, they're manifested, they lead to disease and pathology. So therefore, at the flood with 8 people, there would have been some mutations accumulated, but not nearly as much as the evolutionary story, which says all DNA differences are the result of mutation. So in your out of Africa scenario, this highly inbred population, all of these mutations that have been accruing for millions and millions of years, you got the Australopithecines evolving into Erectus evolving into Homo sapiens, and so on and so forth. And then these mutations all come to the forefront, lead to rapid accelerated genetic degeneration. Think about it, David. Answer me this question. Just steel man my model. Let's see if you understand my model. At Noah's flood or Babel or creation's easy. Two people, Adam and Eve. Well, that was followed by rapid and exponential population growth. Almost no created nuclear heterozygosity would have been lost. There would have been no genetic mutations to come to the forefront. That's why not until Leviticus did Moses actually put into law not to marry close relatives, because that will lead to the problems genetically associated with inbreeding. So answer me this question. At the flood, bottleneck. Okay, you got 8 people. Where's the issue? If we're looking at 99.5% created nuclear heterozygosity, where's the genetic mistakes that are coming to the forefront? If there's no genetic mistakes to come to the forefront, David, I mean, where's the problem? But I want you to argue from the creation model, not from the evolution model. Where's the problem according to our model?
Yeah, that's a fair point. I guess I should. I like the idea of steel manning each other, so let's steel man the argument now. So I'm going to start with the beginning, that God created the heavens and earth in 6 literal days, about 6,000 years ago, and He created man and female in His image and placed them in the Garden of Eden. Because man sinned, He had to kick them out of the Eden as a punishment, and death, suffering, and disease is all as a result of the first man's sin. Before the first man's sin, there was no death, there was no suffering, everything was perfect. After the fall, man became wicked. They multiplied, and God said, "Okay, look, they are too wicked. I have to punish them. I have to send a flood." So God commands Noah to build an ark to save himself and the animal kingdom and all the others, and from there he repopulated, and that happened about 4,500 years ago. And so from there, I guess I should also point out that Noah did not take all the individual species, but only kinds, whatever that is. And so from that, all the ark kinds eventually diversified and evolved into the different species we have, but only within the created kinds. How did I do?
You did good. You did good. So here's the question. Because you explained it correctly, so at creation, you're right. We would have Adam and Eve, okay, with front-loaded genetic diversity, no genetic mutations. Genetic mutations occur after the fall. Right now, we know that the rate in the nuclear genome is about 100 new mutations per person per generation. Mitochondrial DNA about 0.5 per generation. What's funny about that is we can even account for substantial amount of purifying selection in the mitochondrial genome. And let's say 0.1. We'll be generous to the evolutionists. 0.1 mutations per generation in the mitochondrial genome. It's still fast. There's still few differences separating any 2 people. Even if you look at Africa, there's only about 100, 120 maybe. That can easily be explained in 5,500 years or 6,500 years. But evolutionists want us to believe that the origin of mitochondrial Eve was 200,000 years ago. Yeah, how do you come up with that date? But that's kind of a rabbit trail. You can touch on that if you want. My question is, you're right, no genetic mistakes. So, and you explained it earlier in your opening. Can you reiterate for us, for the audience, the definition of inbreeding? Like, why is inbreeding bad, David?
Sure. So let me go back to that slide and share it with everyone. So yeah, inbreeding is the production of offspring from the mating or breeding of individuals or organisms that are closely related. As Joanne Scott notes, who is a genetic counselor, if you had a child with someone in the general population, the chances that the 2 of you would carry the same recessive gene is pretty low. But when you marry a relative, the probability that you're both carrying the same recessive gene is much higher. And so you're at a much higher risk to have a child with a recessive disorder.
Right, exactly. So if those recessive mutations, okay, that are deleterious, they come to the forefront, they lead to disease. At creation, all we have is front-loaded DNA diversity. So what's coming to the forefront that's harmful, that is deleterious in any way to lead to the problems that you're suggesting that would lead to problems in an evolutionary model. Remember, all DNA differences are the result of mutations over time, according to the evolutionists. So that's a huge problem for the out of Africa scenario. Look at the cheetahs. I mean, down to 7,000. You're the one who put the slides up and made the point. So yeah, so you giving the correct definition, you obviously understand it. You understand the model. So therefore, at creation and at the flood, where's the inbreeding problem then?
Sure. Well, obviously the problem will come, according to your model, it'll come right after the fall, when all these mutations supposedly happened and when everything started going downhill. So here's the problem. Between creation and the flood, there was at least almost 2,000 years of mutation in what we see now. And here's, I think, what the ultimate problem is. And I kind of want to cross-examine you a little bit, just kind of understand your ARC model a little bit. And you'll explain, and you'll see where I'm going with this in a minute.
But I just don't want to let you. Well, real quick, because I just don't want to let you off too easy, David, because we've had so many of these discussions, and I did explain this in our human evolution discussion. So here's the thing. Okay, before you do that, cross it. Can you still? Because like I said, and we talked about this before, what's the bigger DNA compartment? Is it the uniparentally inherited DNA? Is it the biparentally inherited DNA? What's the larger DNA compartment, the nuclear genome or the mitochondrial genome?
On top of the nuclear.
Exactly. So the nuclear, we're looking at 3.4 billion letters, okay? And then obviously we inherit 2 copies. We've got 6 billion letters. So if you've got 100 new mutations per person per generation, it's going to be inconsequential after creation, nearly inconsequential after the flood. Genetic entropy is the biggest issue in an evolutionary model. It puts shelf lives on genomes. It shows that we could not have been evolving for millions of years with mutations as the source for all genetic variation that natural selection can work upon. But in a 6,000 year time frame, these mutations are not built up in the same way that the evolutionary model would suggest. So do the math. You got 3.4 billion letters. You got roughly 100 new mutations per person per individual. How many years after creation was the flood? There's not going to be an inbreeding. I mean, I just don't want to let you off the hook. Like, where's the issue then? Where's the inbreeding at that point?
Okay, this is a good question. So now I'm kind of answering this with a question, typical Jewish fashion. But yeah, according to your model, all these other Homo sapien, all these other human species evolved just a few. How long do you say? I think you mentioned it in our last discussion. How long do you think it was before the first Neanderthal came around? What we would consider a Neanderthal or Homo erectus? How long do you think that took after the flood?
Well, after the flood, let's say it would have to be before Babel. I kind of hold to the position that a group of humans migrated in those ice age related conditions pre-Babel. They would have became isolated, just like we see. We can see that they're actually well adapted with their robustness to the ice age environments, which means they were probably closer to the creation event, which means they may have still had those longevity genes that we say as creationists were probably mutated or shut off, for example. Therefore, a population like that with initially probably superior genomes entering a post-flood world, becoming isolated, becoming highly inbred, chances are mutations to the DNA enzymes would have taken place. They would have experienced rapid accelerated genetic degeneration. So I would say it occurred pre-Babel, but
okay,
I mean, you could say within 1,000 years, you could say.
Okay, well, Babel, you said that was pre-Babel, but Babel happened like what, less than 200 years after the flood? When did Babel happen according to your timeline?
Well, when this people, right. So let's say Babel happened within the first 500 years. Now, here's the thing. That people group that would have separated and migrated to a not so good part of the world at the time, they wouldn't have experienced rapid accelerated genetic degeneration right away, but you know that it can occur in small isolated tribes where inbreeding is pretty much the rule. That's why we see island dwarfism with the Naledi, with the hobbits, the newer one, Homo luzonensis. So that's just what we see. So yeah, when that people group left, they wouldn't have been highly genetically compromised. The Neanderthal sequences we have that suggest they were 40% less fit, highly inbred, high levels of homozygosity. This was at a time when they were the most genetically compromised.
Okay, so according to most creationist timelines I read, I mean, we know that Abraham was supposedly born just about 300 years after the flood. Knowledge of Babel. Most people, most creationists would argue that the Tower of Babel happened about 180 to 200 years after the flood, somewhere around that age time frame. But I kind of wanted to get a better understanding of your model, just so I can better know where to attack it from. When it comes to the ark, how many different animals were on the ark?
Well, I mean, David, here we're talking about literal Adam and Eve. I'm asking you what the issue is according to the creation model with inbreed, and now you want to go to the kinds on the ark. Like, why don't we let's first? And that's a good question, but how does that relate to the inbreeding question regarding the? If you want to talk about the kinds, fine. Let's talk about the kinds. How do you address this paper? I've showed it numerous times, right over here, that suggests that I'm going to pull it up right here so you can see it on screen. Boom. The recent barcoding study where they found low levels of genetic diversity in the CO1 gene in the mitochondria, they concluded that over 90% of today's species originated at the same time. They've resorted to a bottleneck, of course, to explain the low levels of genetic diversity. They were shocked. It showed here that species have very clear genetic boundaries. We know of one bottleneck where that could have taken place, which would have been the flood. Those 6,000 to 8,000 kinds that went onto the ark, for example. So how do you explain this new study according to your worldview? This is a direct answer to your question. I mean, boom, this confirms the flood bottleneck and the biblical kinds that were coming off. This is essentially the bottleneck that this study on DNA barcoding in the CO1 gene concludes. Are you familiar with this study, David? Oh, David, you there still?
Oh, I'm sorry. Was I muted?
Yeah, I think you're mute. I think you're no problem. Are you familiar with the barcoding study?
Yeah, yes, I did. But of course, that's not what the study actually found when you actually read the study. And can I share my screen again?
Yeah. Well. Okay. So because I'm sharing screen right now on the paper, but if you're done looking at the information, boom. Okay. So,
yeah, that's also not the paper. That's the reports. So here's the question: did they actually conclude that 90% of the animal species appeared at the same time as humans? And of course, the answer is no. And here's the actual relevant quote from the actual published paper: the extant population, no matter what its current size or similarity to fossil of any age, has expanded from mitochondrial uniformity within the past 200,000 years.
right. But how did they come up with the 200,000 year date? Was it from genetics?
Can I finish talking?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. In other words, the genetic diversity observed in the mitochondrial genome of most species alive today can be attributed to the accumulation of mutations from an ancestral genome within the past 200,000 years. Their conclusions are interesting, but they are not shocking, nor do they defy evolutionary theory. To see why, let's unpack what the authors have claimed. First, it is important to note that the authors never claimed that most species came into existence within the past 200,000 years. Rather, what has come into existence within the time frame is genetic variation observed in one gene in the mitochondrial genome. By tracing the mutations in that one gene, we can trace the origins of the gene back to the last common female ancestor of all living members of a certain species, the so-called mitochondrial Eve. But this discovery at best tells us the minimum age of the species. It tells us little to nothing about the maximum age of the species. To understand the difference between the minimum and the maximum age for species, consider the cheetah. The cheetah has remarkably little genetic variation in both its nuclear and mitochondrial genome. Using the same methods employed by the paper researchers here, this species appears to be no more than 12,000 years old. unlike 90% of other mammalian species, which are hundreds of thousands of years old. However, the fossil record of the cheetah species exists back several 100,000 years. These two observations are not contradictory. The species is very old, but its mitochondrial DNA appears quite young. 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, cheetahs were migrating, presumably as a result of large climatic changes from their native Asian point of origin to their present homes in Africa. It appears this move resulted in a significant population bottleneck, wherein only a small number of cheetahs made it to Africa, the ancestors of the present population. All other cheetahs in Asia, along with their genetic diversity, went extinct. The mitochondrial genetic clock was reset by the genetic bottleneck. Examining mitochondrial DNA variation alone, we can only predict when the most recent bottleneck occurred for the mtDNA lineages found in cheetahs. We cannot predict the age of the cheetahs as a species. This scenario above can be played out for most species. An examination of the mitochondrial genome of any species will only tell us when the most common ancestor of all modern members of the species existed, which will almost invariably occur after the evolutionary origin of the species. What Stoffel and Thackler have potentially discovered by examining the variation of a single gene and the mtDNA is that most species experience a mitochondrial genetic bottleneck between 100 and 200,000 years ago. How might this bottleneck have occurred? They provided several hypotheses. One scenario invokes the effects of significant ice ages during this time period. Such dramatic climate changes has the effect of causing mass migration, leading to the rapid contractions and expansion of population. In such times, variation in mitochondrial lineage is squeezed out of many species, even as they may retain a considerable amount of variation in their main nuclear genome. In this respect, the results reported in this paper are not particularly surprising because they fit well within what we already know about this phase of natural history. So once again, this is a good example of how the media royally screws up science. And I must say, I really hate the media, how it currently is. I hate how they report science. Oftentimes when they report stuff like, I think there was a couple of years ago when some guy did a fake study on chocolate making you live longer, the media pounced on it and just shouted, "Science says eating chocolate makes you live longer," when of course that's not what science says, and that's kind of not what the study was saying either. So this is a good example of how media screwed up science. Hopefully that explanation of the actual paper makes sense. Thank you.
Are you done with? Because Dale, I want to give you as much time as you need there. Is that the BioLogos response to it that you're reading?
That's what I was screen sharing.
Yeah. Okay. So
that's when you actually read the actual study, they did not find that 90% of species suddenly expired at the same time as humans. That is not what they found. Again, if you don't believe BioLogos, read the actual paper.
So for example, BioLogos posted that critique, and because of the obvious conclusions of the data. So if you haven't yet read, I would recommend, have you read Dr. Nathaniel? So Dr. Nathaniel Jensen wrote an extensive response to that article. And just out of curiosity, have you read that one?
I have not. If you can share that with me, please send that in a link, and I will gladly give that a read.
Yeah, so he addresses that article in great detail. Now, of course, when it comes to the 90% species, the low levels of genetic diversity in the CO1 gene, for example, they've resorted to the indirect evidence. So they're not getting the 200,000 year date in the mitochondrial DNA itself. Regarding that study, they're looking to calibration, they're looking to the geological column, of course. Now, they were, as you said, they were surprised that the levels of diversity in the CO1 gene, now why they looked at that little subset of the mitochondria is because it's highly conserved. So it's perfect for DNA barcoding. Now, it's just like the mitochondrial DNA data. It's just like the Y chromosome data, that when you're looking at that which is empirical, okay, with the mitochondrial DNA, with the, well, especially with the pedigree-based studies, the fact that they're fast, the fact that we can be generous to the evolutionist and the evolutionary community and even say 0.1 mutations per generation in the mitochondrial genome, allowing for plenty of purifying selection, still takes us back just 5,500 years. I mean, they have to invoke hardcore substitution rates and phylogeny-based assumptions. So my point, when you read these studies, oftentimes you have a basic assumption or worldview. Now, here's the thing. This data is perfectly in line with Adam and Eve, the Y chromosome data, the mutation accumulation in the Y chromosome. We know the Y chromosome mutates fast, only goes back 4,500 years to our last Y chromosome ancestor, Noah, 6,500 years roughly for Eve, plus this study on DNA barcoding that suggests 90% of species arose at the same time. Now, I get what you're saying, that they are invoking a 200,000 year date, not based on the genetics. They are also invoking bottlenecks, extinction events, and the resetting of the mitochondrial DNA clock. But we don't necessarily have to accept the conclusions or the mechanisms as to how that's possible, since it perfectly fits with our model, especially when we look at all the different data sets. And you can respond to that too. But one thing that I had written down that you talked about, and this is going to take me 2 seconds because I definitely don't want to leave this one unaddressed, is the African diversity, and then I'm going to let you respond as long as you want. So there's a few things that we would propose, okay, and all this is actually consistent with what we know about African historical populations and migration patterns and things like this. So according to our out of Middle East model, okay, which is what Dr. Dan's video was today, the genetic differences between people groups spreading out after Babel, okay, you were talking about founder effects, and I agree with that. You know, that's incredibly important in our model, because the genetic differences would be result from founder effects associated with the fragmentation of the original gene pool. And there's been some extensive papers on this from PhD creationists, and they conclude that given the higher level of genetic diversity in Africa, nobody disagrees with that, the biblical model would require that after the Tower of Babel event, more tribes moved into Africa than into Europe or Asia. B, that the African tribes remained smaller in size and were more isolated from each other for a longer period of time. And what's funny is these scenarios are actually faithful to genetic realities, faithful to the empirical data. And this is exactly what would explain the higher levels of genetic diversity in Africa, because they assume that those high, as you were saying, David, correctly, they assume that those higher levels of genetic diversity in Africa prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that we came from Africa, and therefore Africans are older than other people groups like non-Africans today, when in fact, when we look at all the data as a whole, the African diversity can be better explained in terms of how the human diversity, okay, was subdivided after the biblical dispersion out of Babel. That means the divergence of those people groups does not require a slow accumulation of mutations over deep time, but they can arise instantly by what? As I said earlier, the fragmentation of the source population, and like you were talking about, strong founder effects, then followed by assortative mating. And it's all going to come down to, though, that which leads to the best testable predictions. And we can see traces of Babel in our genomes. I mean, how do you explain, David, and then address whatever you want, how do you explain that Y chromosomes, for example, they're so geographically specific, which is perfectly consistent with the fact that at Babel, you have all these different people groups that are migrating to all parts of the earth, and then mutations start occurring independently in the male lineages in those Y chromosomes, and now we have these geographically specific Y chromosome. We also see that there's only about 3 main mitochondrial DNA lines. I mean, we can all trace this back to a Babel event. So I talked a lot there, David. Take a few minutes and just respond. And I'll be listening. I'm just going to run upstairs, get a glass of water. I can hear though. So address whatever you want. Take your time. David, I think you're on mute.
Okay, yeah, sure. Sorry. So yeah, I guess as he says, is what actually makes the most sense. What comes down to the most successful predictions, but also we have to consider what makes the most sense. Occam's razor, of course, is very important in science and just in general. What theories actually make sense with the data? Because not only we have the most genetic diversity in Africa, but as the video that Dr. Dan showed, we can also have a phylogeny, DNA phylogeny going back to Africa, and we have the nested hierarchy, I think, as well. All of that independent evidence, the independent evidence of the fossil record, the independent evidence of the genetic diversity in the bottleneck and the founder effects, the independent evidence of the mitochondrial DNA and the mitochondrial Y DNA that also points back to Africa. All of these scenarios, all of these independent lines should use the Occam's razor, say, okay, obviously the origins of humanity, therefore, must be in Africa. I do want to ask, kind of as a sidebar note, the Bible says that the ark landed in the mountains of Ararat. It doesn't specify a mountain, but rather a whole mountain range. So my question for standing is why couldn't the ark's landing place be in Africa rather than in the Middle East? And just from your model, couldn't that also explain the evidence as well? Like, is it possible for the ark to have been in Africa?
Before I answer that, I just want to make sure that you feel you've had enough time to address the points that I made. Dave, is there anything else you want to address in what I was saying?
No. I think that's good because we've definitely been going back and forth for over 90 minutes now, and then we both brought up a lot of points, and there's still a lot of points that we haven't addressed. There's a lot of points you haven't addressed from my end, and I haven't addressed everything from your end. So it'll probably be a good idea to kind of just to start wrapping things up a little bit because it is almost 2 a.m. my time. But before we do conclude, we're perhaps going to do this post backstage. I do have a couple of questions about your model on the ark, kind of sidebar unrelated to the astrophysics topic, but just to get a better understanding of your model.
Okay, yeah, let me answer that question. So I don't believe it has to be invoked. The Tower of Babel would be the event that we're looking to, where all people groups, for the most part, obviously there's exceptions to the rules, like possibly the mutant forms that were separated pre-Babel, would indicate the Middle East. But here's the thing. We don't need to invoke the out of Africa because when you actually look at the data itself, okay, yes, Africa does have more genetic diversity than the rest of the world. Actually, more than the rest of the world combined. As a matter of fact, 2 people living in different cultural groups within Africa itself can have more differences than like myself or somebody in Asia, for example. Now, here's the thing. Evolutionists have always made assumptions on population histories, for example. They've made assumptions on generation times, how many kids the Africans might have been having. But the fact is, when we actually go away from the Middle East in any country in the world, do you know what happens, David? Genetic diversity decreases. Okay, this is true in Africa as well. Actually, some of the most homogeneous populations in the world are amongst the native Africans. So if we travel south in Africa and west in Africa, genetic diversity decreases. The hotspot of diversity is right next to where biblical creation is, where I say was the Tower of Babel. And the fact is, okay, where we actually choose to put the center of genetic diversity, all comes down to a matter of worldview differences. Yeah, evolutionists like Dr. Dan or experts in the field, they'll put it somewhere in Africa, okay, because it's just too close for comfort. But for us, based on what we know about genetic diversity, we put it in the Middle East where Babel was located. And then at the Tower of Babel event, what happened? God separated the nations according to their languages, according to the male lineage, which is why we see the Y chromosome, the geographical specificity of Y chromosomes. And modern genetics has actually discovered just that, a single dispersal of people groups around the world. If you could, because I asked that direct question, the Y chromosomes, how geographically specific they are, or the allele frequencies around the globe. The traces of Babel in our genetics. How do you explain that, David? I think you're on mute again, David.
Sorry. I'm sorry. Can you repeat that question? Because it is getting late. Can you repeat that question one more time?
Okay, so the geographically specific nature of, say, the Y chromosomes, because if we dispersed at Babel, and as we know, according to the Bible, God did it through the male lineages, and we know that Y chromosomes are passed on from father to son. We can look at the X chromosomes, we can look at the mitochondrial DNA haplogroups, of course, but let's focus on the Y chromosomes. Therefore, you have people groups leaving Babel, going to all different parts of the world where you have independent mutations accruing in those Y chromosomes in different parts of the world. And we find exactly that. Y chromosomes are geographically specific, which means we have traces of Babel in our genetics. How do you explain that?
Okay. I'm still not quite understand how that is indicative of a Babel event instead of just a thing that's coming out of Africa. I'm just looking at a paper here, the geographic distribution of the human Y chromosome variant. We examine the variation of the non-recurring portions of the human Y chromosome to investigate human evolution during the past 200,000 years. The Y-specific polymorphic sites included in the YALU intersectional polymorphism, or the YAP element, associated with the YAP element, 3-point mutation in close association with the YAP insertion site, an an AG polymorphic transition, and a tetranucleotide microsatellite, etc. Gave rise to 5 YAP haplogroups in 60 populations from Africa, Europe, Asia, Australia, and the world, combining the multi-allelic variations in the multi-allelic. All 5 of the YAP haplogroups and 21 of the 27 combination haplogroups were found in African populations, which had a greater haplotype diversity than the populations from other geographical locations. Only a subset of the 5 YAP haplogroups were found outside of Africa. Only subsets of the 5 YAP haplogroups were found outside Africa. Patterns of observed variation were compatible with a variety of hypotheses, including the multiple human migrations and range expressions. So from the Y-DNA, the study here clearly shows that, of course, the Y-DNA diversity is greater in Africa, which is also another cross-confirmation of the out of Africa hypothesis. And again, right there in the abstract, patterns.
In that paper or in any papers, do they find any, and here's what's key, do they find any highly divergent Y chromosomes in any people groups on this planet?
I'm not sure because let me just, it's paper, full paper.
Well, that's the issue. The fact that we have such low variation in Y chromosome. Okay, now if our Y chromosome goes back hundreds of thousands of years, if there has been mutation rates or rates of gene conversion or whatever, that's required to explain why the human Y chromosome and the chimpanzee Y chromosome are so divergent, we should find some human Y chromosomes that appear ancient or highly divergent. But yet, no, every single human Y chromosome is reflective of a young genome, of a young dispersal at Babel. I mean, if you can find, that's kind of, and same with the mitochondrial DNA. No evidence for any mitochondrial DNA lineages that appear ancient. Haven't you noticed, David, that whenever you read these papers, the evolutionist side are always invoking like extinction events or mitochondrial DNA resets, or like, for example, that one paper with the species arising at the same time with the low diversity in the CO1 gene in the mitochondria. Isn't it funny how there's no evidence in the geological column for such a bottleneck 200,000 years ago, but yet they invoke it anyways? Or the problems associated with the out of Africa hypothetical population bottleneck. I mean, it's just like, from a biblical creationist perspective, David, why would we ever choose the alternative? I mean, it's exactly what we would expect reading from the Bible from our starting point in Genesis. So why would we? Is there any reason, David? Let's end it here, and then I'm going to give you as much time as you want for your closing, and I'll do the same. Then we'll read the super chats. Do you believe anything discussed today should be reason for a biblical creationist to accept, let's say, ape to man evolution, or accept the out of Africa theory, when in fact it's all very nicely consistent with the biblical starting point? Go ahead, David, and then you can lead into your closing and talk as much as you want.
Yeah, sure. I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
Given the genetic data that we've been talking about, my question would be, from a biblical creationist perspective, is there any reason for us to adopt the evolutionist explanations or conclusions in these papers? I mean, if they're the ones always invoking extinction events, mitochondrial DNA resets, bottlenecks, hypothetical bottlenecks, why? All the data, the low genetic diversity, the Y chromosome, the mitochondrial DNA, the three major haplogroups, the geographical specific nature of Y chromosomes, allele frequency distribution around the earth, it's all consistent with a Babel dispersal. So why is it? My point is, I understand from your position, you're holding to evolutionary theory at your basic starting point, but why should a biblical creationist reject the Genesis interpretation when all the data is just so consistent with it? Is there any reason why we should reject that?
I'm sure. Thank you. That is an excellent question. And I guess it all goes back down to, again, the within the out of Africa hypothesis. Again, none of us disagree the fact that Africans do have the highest genetic diversity. Of course, I think the obvious answer to that question is that that Africa is the birthplace of humanity, and that this lower diversity outside of Africa is, in fact, all related to the lower diversity outside of Africa is a direct result of the founder effect. As populations move outside of Africa, they take their genetics with them, and they lose genetic diversity there. So again, we have several different confirmations of evidence within the Y-DNA, the mDNA. As I was saying, the Y chromosome shows that Adam was also an African. Africans also have the highest Y-DNA variation. So again, both the mitochondrial and the Y-DNA evidence both shows that our most recent common ancestor was an African. So we have those two independent verifiable evidence. The third independent evidence is the wealth of fossils that exist just in Africa alone. And number fourth, I know we didn't really get to go into detail and just talk about the fossils. Maybe we'll do that at another time. Trying to think what else here. And also the fact that everything is as Dr. James said in the video, we can indeed create a phylogenetic tree based upon the mtDNA analysis of humans. And as I showed in my opening PowerPoint slide, and unfortunately I don't think Standing Truth ever got to address it, but I actually showed the map that we were able to create the mitochondrial mtDNA haplogroups that we are able to recreate just by the same exact DNA evidence that was able to trace me, that linked me from Europe to the southern United States. It's the same DNA evidence, the same exact process that is used to create the map that I showed in the very first slide in my opening arguments, when I showed that we can create a migration map from Sub-Saharan Africa. So my question for Standing for Truth is, I guess I'll conclude my closing statements, and I'll ask Andy for Truth. The question is, how much evidence would be required for you to actually accept the out of Africa hypothesis, and why couldn't Babel or Noah's Ark have been in Africa?
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. Those final words and concluding statement, David. Once again, it's been a great debate, great discussion. I always enjoy these discussions with you, especially these topics, some of my favorite topics. So in answer to the question, I have answered it many times, actually, that according to our model, and we actually see this with historical population demographics and histories with African people groups, but even when it comes to the Neanderthals, a lot of it is the same, because let's say early in the post-flood human population of about, let's say, 1,000 to 10,000 people, Dr. Carter has modeled it, roughly between 1,000 and 10,000 people was split apart at Babel. All these different people groups went different directions on the globe. And what does that mean? Well, each saw different environmental pressures. They would have experienced different demographic pressures. They were subject to different mutational events. Neanderthals were one of those groups. When you get into a condition where you've got a lack of vitamin D, or you are under natural selection where it works on the short term, for example, so those DNA repair enzymes are damaged, for example, that can lead to hypermutation. But it often comes down to the fact that they had a different history. The Africans had a different history as well. They would have entered into, after Babel, they would have entered as tribes into Africa, of course. It comes down to fixation, for example. So those genetic markers in your phylogenetic trees, you're trying to say, like, especially with the Neanderthals, that they fall outside the human species. They are a separate species, or a sister species. And then but of course, the different population histories, the different environmental pressures, the mutations. And in those small populations, that was a direct answer to your question, is the mutations that can become fixated quickly. And then they go extinct. And then modern humans evolve independently for another few thousand years. Here we are today. Of course, we're going to find some divergence. We're going to find some uniqueness in the genetic markers. And the evolutionists interpret that differently. But the fact is, we do see the hypermutation. We see evidence of that in the Neanderthal genomes themselves. When it comes to, because it seems like you're hung up on the African genetic diversity, and you're assuming that the more mutations and diversity in Africans is because they are an old population. But here's the thing. When it comes to the Africans themselves, we know just from history, we just know that they have existed in small tribes. We know that the divergence can be explained through fixation of new mutations. The genetic diversity would be explained perfectly from that starting point as well. I mean, if you've got different histories, different environmental conditions, you've got people groups living in tribes, you're going to have fixed mutations, and this is what's going to show up on the phylogenetic analysis. But those phylogenetic analyses always assume the human chimp split, assume deep time evolution, for example. And the reason why we wouldn't have to assume an African origin, for example, with Ararat, is because, as I was explaining before, the diversity, the assumptions, for one, that the proponents are making regarding the African history, the generation times, the number of children they've had, the constancy of mutations, all of these assumptions have actually been questioned. And when you have these small tribes that I'm talking about going into Africa, living in Africa, well, what does that result in? Inbreeding. And then inbreeding, as we've talked about, inbreeding is negative. It's bad because you get a rapid fixation of harmful mutations. That would have affected African small tribes. That would affect the Neanderthals, for example. So here's the big thing that just kind of demolishes that argument that you're putting forth, and Dr. Dan too. We know that African populations, we know they were divided into small groups of people. This is not contested. They would have remained small. They would have been separated for long periods of time. Well, there you go. Those tribes, those small tribes would have diverged rapidly. The more fixated mutations, the more the populations would diverge. So when you look at those phylogenetic analyses, you are interpreting it as we first came from Africans. Africans are older than 6,000 years. Africans are older than non-Africans, when in fact, it is only due to those conditions that allowed those small African tribes to diverge rapidly. And then we see that the genetic diversity, the more you move from the Middle East, anywhere you go in the world, genetic diversity decreases. So this is all consistent with the Out of Babel event. So an answer to your question, I guess a long answer would be we don't need to. I mean, the Bible says the Tower of Babel. We can assume that was the Middle East, and that's exactly what the data in the mitochondrial genome, in the Y chromosome. We know that the entire fossil record, when it comes to the hominins, is nothing but a bushy mess. The Australopithecines coexisted, and yeah, evolutionists can say that the subpopulations of Australopithecines evolved into modern humans, while some stuck around. But the bigger problem is the fact that the Australopithecines did coexist with the Homo genus, according to the evolutionary theory, and that is why we find a lot of intermingling, and then it's mistaken as transitional forms. And so it's just a huge mess, and they will even agree with that. So, and you talked about founder effects as a huge aspect of the out of Middle East scenario. So I do believe I answered all the questions, and we could always continue this at a time in the future. But it's been a lot of fun, and we've been at it for a while, and we've kept a good audience, over 30 pretty much the whole time. Hope they had a good time. We had a heck of a lot of super chats, so I want to get to them. Praise emailed me the super chat, so I was kind of losing my train of thought there because I was looking for the email and looking them over here. So why don't we let's see. Okay, so let's start it here. We'll start with the super stickers. Doki Doki Bible Club, super sticker, thank you so much. We love the support, guys. Let's see here. Super Whore Energy, $4.99 super chat. Purification happens naturally. Purifying selection happens. Selection removes the worst deleterious mutations. Selection can amplify the best beneficial mutations, but especially when it comes to genetic entropy, selection breaks down when it comes to the nearly neutral mutations, the ones that build up invisible, essentially, because they are only slightly harmful. So purifying selection does happen, and that's why when it comes to the mitochondrial DNA, the molecular clocks, we account for it. We give them the benefit of the doubt. We because it's generally known that it's about 0.5 per generation in the mitochondrial genome. We can account for extensive amounts of purifying selection, even at a rate of 0.1 still brings us back 5,500 years. How do you get to the, I'll turn it around to David if you want to answer it. It's more of a rhetoric question, I guess. But since they're questions, David could have a word. How do you, just using the empirical rate, what type of mutation rate or what type of substitution rates do you have to invoke to actually get your 200,000 year date for mitochondrial Eve? You don't have to answer that, David, but I do think it's a big problem. If you want, you can. But do you have anything to say on the question, the super chat? I think you're on mute.
Sorry, not at this time. I think I just don't. I'm kind of getting really tired right now, and so it's a little bit past 2 a.m. my time.
I know, me too. So, and it looks like these are all for me for the most part. So, I'll go through them real quick. Well, actually, brother Mitchell, $5 super chat. Thank you so much. He's got a funny one. He says, "I have an uncle that looks like a textbook Neanderthal. No joke," he says. And then he says Neff. So you can comment to that if you want.
No comments.
And I always show that pic because a lot of times these bones in the hominin fossil record, they're found in isolation. So if you were to find the skull cap of some of the individuals that exist today, for example, there's a specific, I believe he's a Russian boxer, it would be automatically concluded to be a Neanderthal. So when bones are found, and a lot of people say, well, that guy's got, a chin consistent with modern humans. It's like, did you not get my point that these are oftentimes found in isolation? So the skull cap's found in isolation without the chin. They're going to categorize it as a Neanderthalensis, when in fact, it's not a Neanderthal. David, you can have a word if you'd like.
Yeah, that is completely incorrect. In fact, if you guys are interested in playing the game, there's actually very interesting. If you kind of want to put yourself as a scientist examining such a skull, the Smithsonian Institute of Human Origins actually has a thing on your website where you can pretend to be a scientist examining a skull and trying to figure out where this belongs and what species this skull belongs to. So if you're actually interested in seeing how that plays out, I strongly recommend going there.
Sure, yeah. Thanks, David. So let's see. So we got Doki Doki Bible Club, another $5 super chat. Thank you so much. Let's see what else we got here. Cameron super sticker. Thank you. Another Doki Doki Bible Club, $1.49. We love you. Stupid Horror Energy. You always make the Q&As a lot of fun, especially on MDD. So keep them coming. We did that one. Let me see. Stupid. I know there's another one in here. Stupid Horror Energy has SFT read papers that on mtDNA that exclude the control region. Yes. As far as I know, there are 37 genes in mitochondrial DNA. So the question would be which one? The CO1 gene, like David and I were discussing with the result of that paper with the low genetic diversity in the CO1 gene, is an incredibly good one to investigate. It's highly conserved and they all give fast rates regardless. So the big thing to take is when you've got mutation rate studies in like the D loop, which is the control region, highly variable, as well as pedigree-based studies in the whole mitochondrial genome, they corroborate. And then creation scientists are making testable predictions. So the question is, once again, that I never get an answer is, why are they working so well? You're probably just as tired as me, David, but you can respond if you'd like to.
I'm not going to respond.
No problem. Okay, so let's see. I think we only got one. Let's see, one more super chat. Okay, Stupid Horror Energy. Once again, $5. Thank you. We appreciate it. The Y chromosome paper. You understand it's looking at a highly mutable region. I'm guessing she's talking about the Dr. Jensen one. So at least she's responding to it because I've been bringing it up for lots of debates and we don't seem to get any decent responses to the Y chromosome data. But what's funny is the regional filter that Carmen used is the one that everyone uses, everyone else in the field uses. But in their study, they actually admitted it didn't give them the results they were looking for. So what they did, as usual, is they invented more filters, which no one else in the field uses. And it's just incredible because when you look at the supplementary data and material, Dr. Jensen looked at the high quality sequencing in the Y chromosome and discovered that it mutates fast enough to the point where there's only been about 4,500 years worth of mutations, and there's no highly divergent Y chromosomes on the planet today in any people groups. Well, what's going on if deep time evolution is true? So that was actually a good question. We need more like that. So SWE, always keeping it fun. Another one, Stupid Horror Energy, $9.99. And I think this is the last one. So it's a competition, SWE versus Doki Doki Bible Club. You guys did great. What do you mean by front loading? When I think of front loading, I think of genes that don't have functions until they are needed, but such genes would be weeded out. That's actually a good question. So front loading would be what we see today. That's why the best way I always say to determine what's created, what's the result of mutation, is allele frequencies, that which is common, right? That's why at the beginning I said that Adam would have only needed the 10 to 15 million common variants and to be front loaded, and that would explain everything we see today. So the ones that are not disease causing, the ones that are functional, those would be the ones that we would say are the front loaded ones. Now, that's an interesting point about, she says, she thinks of them not having functions until they are needed. Well, that immediately brings to mind the epigenetics or epigenome, above and beyond the genome, where there's these chemical tags and there's these genes that are just being ready to be turned on through adaptive episodes and environmental changes. And we see this today. I've got paper upon paper where rapid evolution is observed. A lot of times these so-called best beneficial mutations are the result of epigenetic adaptation, epigenetic changes. And when it comes to natural selection, weeding out those genes, well, these genes are in the genome as backup code. Oftentimes the redundant elements, they are utilized as backup code, kind of like a spare tire in a car, which would be looked at as useless and redundant. Get rid of it, the evolutionists would say, when in fact you get a flat tire, it's incredibly useful. So the better question is, why wouldn't natural selection, or how does natural selection evolve that which requires forward thinking, like the epigenetic mechanisms, like the redundant elements? So that would all be part of the front loading. God would have also front loaded the DNA elements known as the ERVs, the retrotransposons, the ALUs. This is all part of the initial front loading. And yeah, good question. I hope I addressed that the best I can at 2:30 in the morning. And since I talked a lot there at the Q&A, it was fun. David, I'm going to give you the last word of tonight before I just kind of close it down. But I want to thank you again for doing this. This is a good debate. Very good debate. This is a great topic.
Yeah, I definitely think this is probably one of my best performances yet. What do you think, Standing? Even though I feel I'm crap at debates.
I would say that it was a very enjoyable debate. It was one of this topic I enjoy incredibly, and I would say it was a lot of fun. I got nothing bad to say. I think there's some questions that maybe I got nothing else to say, but it was a good debate. Some questions maybe I'll just send you in private that I feel like you didn't answer.
Yeah, let's chat about behind the scenes. But I do want to ask you, are you available to have a discussion tomorrow on your channel on accelerated nuclear decay? Because I really wanted to get to that topic, but we just didn't get into it today.
Good question. So because we did a debate tonight for over 2 hours, I've got one Friday, Saturday, and tomorrow's probably going to be a night off, to be honest with you, from debate. So, but I'm thinking just to not overload the channel, because you're also debating here on Friday. Let's set that debate up after the Friday. And to anybody in the audience, I mean, we still got a good 30 people. So all night we've had a lot of people. David Neff and I have debated dating methods for a couple hours. A few weeks ago? So we are going to have a round 2 at some point.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to do that tonight, but Standing wanted to do this topic, so I agreed to it. I was definitely much more prepared for the other topic, because that's what I've been preparing for the past couple of weeks. But I think I did pretty well kind of swinging things as best I can. But yeah, if you don't mind, Standing, I want to chat a little bit backstage once we close out the stream, because I have a couple questions for you.
Sounds good. Okay, guys. Well, thanks for being here. Mitchell says, great debate, guys. Yes, very good debate. I enjoyed it. Anybody has any questions, let me know. Doki Doki says, good job, SFT and David. Awesome. Well, we're glad everybody enjoyed. That's the most important part of these debates. It's been a lot of time. It's been a lot of fun. Time flew by. I'm pretty tired, so I'm probably going to be getting to bed soon. So one final word, be here Friday, Battle of the Neffs, Global Flood. It's going to be a lot of fun. And Saturday, we got a good one too. So, guys.
And on my debate, there is going to be an open mic after show Friday after my debate on my YouTube channel. It'll be a fun kind of a wind down, open topic. Just overall a good song.
It's going to be good. It's going to be those after shows are oftentimes ones to remember. So we're going to be looking forward to that one. And yeah, we're going to call it a night. Thanks for joining us tonight, guys. Standing for Truth is out.